Good evening and welcome to this episode of Chick Talk. I'm John Houston, Director of Business Services for Protrition Feed. Thank you for joining us this evening. It's my pleasure to introduce our guest once again, Miss Gray Parks. Gray is one of the nutritionists for Protrition Feed, and we're glad that she's here. She's an equine enthusiast, but also a poultry enthusiast. So certainly appreciate you being here, Gray, and to talk a little bit about now that it's almost, as the time we're filming this, almost April. So we're looking at these chicks that have been in the brooder, ready to come out here either now or in a week or two, and ready to start the next phase of life, especially, you know, our layers and that type of thing. So first of all, at about what age do we expect to see some eggs coming from these pulleys?
So most of our traditional chicken breeds are going to lay between 20 and 24 weeks, 5 to 6 months. If you have some really high production strains like the sex links or leghorns, you might get eggs a little earlier than that. And some of the larger breeds like Brahmas may be a little slower, but usually that 5 to 6 month range is what you're looking at. So
before we get into some nutritional things and some feedstuffs and that kind of thing, how much room does a pullet or a hen need, especially if they're going to be confined in a pen or a coop or that type of thing? You know, this day and time, most people are free ranging, I understand, but how much room would a hen need to be productive?
So in the coop, you want to allow about 4 square feet per chicken and at least 1 linear foot of roost space per bird. And then in the run, where they're going to spend most of their daytime hours, about 10 square feet per bird. And even if you plan on free ranging, it's nice to have that run space available in the event that you need to lock your birds down for some reason, such as a predator attack or recently the avian influenza issues that we've been dealing with in Tennessee.
So what about nesting boxes? How many hens to the nesting box, or what's a general rule of thumb? I know these hens depends on the size and, you know, are they the heavy breeds or whatever, but what would you suggest on that? So
usually 1 box per 5 or 6 hens work, but you'll find, I think, that no matter how many hens and how many boxes you have, they do like to all lay in the same box. They feel safer seeing that there's another hen that's chosen as a good place to lay. So it's not uncommon to find 3 crammed in there all at the same time. And that's just kind of an evolutionary survival device that chickens have developed. And it's why using fake eggs to show them where to lay works so well.
Absolutely. So let's talk just a little bit then. We're coming into spring, the beginning of spring, and how does this daylight length relate to egg production?
So chickens are long day breeders, like a lot of our livestock species, which means that they're most productive during the longest days of the year. To be at their peak of production, they really need about 14 to 16 hours of daylight per day. So this time of year, as the days are getting longer, you'll notice the chickens laying more. It's also why if you get, say, fall chicks, then you may have a longer period to wait for your chicks to start laying, because if they're coming into maturity during January, they may not start laying, even though they're 20 or 24 weeks of age, for another month or so.
Right. So now let's transition just a little bit to some feedstuffs. Let's start with things like scratch feed and maybe a peck block or some of what I would refer to as a treat. Where do they fit in our feedstuffs?
So the chicken's primary diet should be a balanced ration for what you're feeding it. Anything in addition to your complete layer diet needs to be limited to no more than about 10% of that animal's diet. So I know it's tempting to mix the layer pellet, for example, with scratch to try to cut costs on the feed. But the chickens will generally choose to eat the scratch first. They'll get a lot of calories and not a lot of nutrition from that, and you get fat hens that don't produce very well. So you want to limit their scratch access. I personally use it just for rounding them up at the end of the night. My hens know when I shake a cup that it's time to come and get their scratch, and everybody goes inside and I don't chase chickens in the dark. A peck block is kind of the same way. It's more of an enrichment tool for the birds than a dietary supplement. So it's a really good thing to use when you do have to confine your chickens if they're used to free ranging, to give them something else to do. Or at a time when you're integrating new pullets into the flock. gives the birds something to do besides chase the newcomers in their flock.
Right. So when we talk about a balanced diet, talk a little bit about maybe protein requirements. It's in particular, everybody looks at protein, and you and I know there's more to a feedstuff than just crude protein. But from a protein requirement for laying hens, what would you suggest there?
So at minimum in a laying ration, you're looking for about 16% crude or total protein. A lot of hens will lay better on a slightly higher protein and a slightly higher lysine and methionine, specific amino acid contents. So our basic layer pellet is a 16% protein, as is our crumble, but then we also have our 22% layer concentrate in a small pellet. That's really good when you're wanting to push production in your hens, or if you're like me in free range or do feed a lot of scraps and treats, then that more concentrated, higher protein layer pellet will help to compensate for the lower quality treats the hens are getting.
Right. So when you talked about the 22%, that what I call the mini pellet, 22% mini pellet, do you see any difference in a mini pellet and a standard pellet or a crumble as it relates to consumption from birds?
So yes, especially when it comes to crumbles. Crumbles, you're getting a lot more waste from the birds. By nature of the smaller particle size, they're going to tend to not want to eat the pieces of the crumble that have broken down a little bit. So pellets will generally have more uniform consumption and more overall consumption. The mini pellets are a really nice size, especially if you have varying ages and sizes of birds in your flock. If you have some smaller or even bantam birds in your flock, that mini pellet's a little bit easier for them to consume.
So when you think about feedstuffs, we have to think about water. So with all animals, that's a very important nutrient that we have to provide. Talk a little bit about waterers and about keeping that water clean and fresh.
Yes, water is critical. A hen will usually drink about twice as much water as she eats food, which is going to be 1 or 2 cups of water for most hens per day, but that can easily double when it's hot outside, for one thing. So if you have water that's gotten dirty and your hen reduces her water intake because the water is dirty, she'll reduce her feed intake and her laying. So you're going to get kind of a triple whammy there. So you want water that's clean, you want water that's cool when it's hot outside and warm when it's cold outside. So you want to make sure you're putting it into, if not a temperature controlled area, at least a sheltered from the elements area with your water. I'm very fond of poultry nipples on my waterers because then the hens can't kick bedding into the waterer. It stays clean, stays a lot more controlled. And I actually screwed my poultry nipples into an old kitty litter jug that I had cleaned out, so I've got a handle to carry it around when I fill it.
Absolutely. So when you think about clean water, keeping the feeders clean and really in a position where feed can't get scratched out of them and that type of thing, that's all important. But you talked about hot weather, and we are talking about birds, and so what will we see when these birds get hot, and how will we what will we see, and then how will we need to ventilate if we're keeping them inside a lot or whatever the ventilation is needed.
Yes, ventilation is critical. Birds are not hot weather animals. Adult chickens are most comfortable around 65 degrees, give or take. And they'll start experiencing heat stress pretty rapidly, as low as 80, 85 degrees if they don't have shade and good ventilation. In fact, on our first 79-degree day here recently, my hens were walking around with their wings kind of spread out, trying to get themselves cooler because they weren't used to that kind of weather yet. So you want to make sure, especially in a free range scenario, that you have lots of cover and shade. If you have your chickens in a run, that they have shade, that you have really good ventilation in that coop and in the run. We tend to think about trying to build coops and build runs to protect from winter weather. But in our climate, it's the summer weather that's much more dangerous for your chickens. So you almost really can't have enough ventilation in there, especially if they are locked up for any reason, because chicken waste has a lot of ammonia and you'll get respiratory disease, and you can even have birds die from lack of ventilation. So really, ventilation is key. When they do get hot, they're probably going to eat less in that heat stress scenario, and you're going to see rapid declines in their production. So if you notice your hens with their wings out or panting, that's a sign that they're experiencing heat stress. And if possible, getting them into some kind of shaded area can help for sure in that scenario.
So one other thing as it relates to feedstuffs, talk to our audience just a little bit about calcium sources and the need for that, as well as grit.
Yes, so calcium is critical for our laying hens. Laying hens need about 3 to 4% calcium in their total diet, which is a much higher number than you would expect to see in a growing chicken diet, for example. And it's very important that we give them a good quality balanced source of that. And layer rations are going to be at least 3%, closer to 3.5% in some cases, calcium. But it's a good idea to also provide on the side of your layer ration free choice access to oyster shells or crushed limestone, which the chickens can take in and get kind of a slow release calcium. Because if the hen doesn't take in enough calcium in her diet, then she'll pull that calcium from her bones and you'll get leg injuries. And if you still don't supply that, then you're going to start seeing thin eggshells, lack of eggshells in your diet. I hear a lot of concern from backyard chicken keepers about too high of calcium for if you have roosters or growing chicks, and that can be a concern. Usually only if you're feeding that over a prolonged period of time to a bird that's not laying. In that case, you can feed an unmedicated chick starter with that oyster shell on the side, but it's not the ideal way to feed your laying hens, and that's kind of a compromised scenario. And then it's important to differentiate between calcium sources and grit, because those are two different things. Grit are what we call insoluble. So they're rocks that are really, really hard for the body to break down that the chicken swallows to help grind their feed. So if your chickens are in a confinement scenario, you want to make sure that in addition to their oyster shell or calcium source, they also have a grit source. If they free range over a large area, then they're probably getting most of their grit from natural ground in our area.
You know, this is shaping up, as I hear from our co-op stores across our territory, to be a fantastic poultry year. They can't keep chicks over, some of them, a few hours. So certainly we're looking forward to being able to supply feedstuffs to these birds, and each family that's buying chicks having a successful grow out with these chicks, and also successful production with their egg production and that type of thing. But any other comments that you would make about our layers in particular as it relates to feedstuffs or care, or and one thing I was going to mention is when we talk about the nature of the birds and some cannibalism amongst birds, and what might be the cause of that, and how would we prevent that?
So a lot of the aggression and cannibalism issues you see in backyard flocks in particular are when we underestimate how much space the birds need. Especially if you're buying, say, one of the prefab coops that you can pick up out of your local stores. Those are really nice starter equipment, but it's important to recognize they usually vastly underestimate the number of chickens, or overestimate the number of chickens you can put into those. And so anytime you can give the birds more space, the better. Additionally, something like a peck block, hanging a head of cabbage, something to give the birds something to do. The more enrichment you can provide, a pile of leaves to dig through, to let chickens have their natural behaviors to dig and peck and not pick at each other. But sometimes there is one problematic bird that probably needs to be removed from the flock if all of those interventions don't stop the cannibalistic behavior.
Right. And then one other question before we wrap up. It's more, I guess, on the health side of things, but we hear about mites and that type of thing, especially if you're keeping too many birds in a coop and that kind of thing. How would you prevent that, and then how might you treat that if you have that issue?
So good cleanliness is really going to be your major option for prevention. You want to make sure that you have clean bedding, that you're not using contaminated bedding materials, that the birds have access to an area to dust bathe, which is one of their primary parasite and general health, skin health management practices that they'll entertain. You can dust the birds for mites, but the most common kind of holistic option of diatomaceous earth for that is not nearly as effective as a true insecticide dust for your birds if it gets to that point. So space and cleanliness is really where you want to go.
Well, that's what I wanted you to hit on. Is it's very important to keep things clean and in order. And if we want to have animals, livestock, birds, anything like that, it requires care, and we certainly need to keep things clean and especially our feedstuffs and our water and our bedding and that type of thing. So, Gray, thank you for being here this evening. We want to thank our audience for tuning in. If you have further questions about anything poultry related, see the folks at your local farmers co-op. Thank you.